Okay, it is a beautiful day in March in Scotland. The birds are out, it's sunny, I'm wearing sunglasses, I'm not wearing a jacket, I'm not wearing a hat. It's pretty much perfect. Winter is definitely over, so that's nice to hear. You can probably hear some birds in the background as I walk. So my guest today is Dr. Ciaran Fairman, PhD, CSCS. Dr. Fairman has a great background in strength and conditioning, and then he pivoted over to work in public health, also specifically focusing on exercise and oncology, so working with cancer patients. And I found Dr. Fairman's work actually just randomly. I was doing some research on another topic, and I don't know how, but I found this paper of his, which we'll talk about a lot in the interview. And it's a narrative review. And the way Dr. Fairman describes it is what he really tried to do was he tried to distill everything he learned, all the practical knowledge that he learned in his experience as an exercise scientist, bridging the gap between what he talks about, this physiological lens, with this behavioral change lens, which is really important. And that's really kind of the thrust of this conversation today. We try to tackle sometimes the disconnect that we see in strength and exercise prescription and where it sometimes falls flat in real world. So immediately when I started reading this paper, he talked about a lot of terms that I felt were very important, a lot of terms that people learn in implementation science or public health work, but sometimes don't make it over to the exercise science side of things. So he talked about the difference between efficacy and effectiveness, which is essentially the difference between clinical, whether or not something works in a clinical setting and whether it works in real life. He talks about generalizability, he talks about sustainability, all these things that are really, really important, but often just get missed, especially when people are on social media arguing about what the most effective exercise program is in terms of sets, reps, intensity. So that's really the heart of the conversation. We go into a lot of different places, but you'll tell that Ciaran just really knows his stuff. He's really thought about this a lot, and I think he does such a good job of bridging different worlds. He has all this great experience, and the more and more I talk to people, the more I realize is that we need to find these people who can effectively communicate the importance of both the physiological benefits of exercise, but also embedding them in the real world and looking at all the real barriers that people face and how we can actually make physical activity sustainable and meaningful to people. So this was a really great conversation, I thought. I hope you enjoy it, and I will talk to you on the back end.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, I'm here today with Dr. Ciaran Fairman, and I found Dr. Fairman's work actually kind of randomly. I was looking on information and recommendations for designing home strength programs, and I was finding all these issues with a lot of the assumptions about the way that the programs were designed. And for me, I just felt like they were lacking a certain lens. I feel like there wasn't enough emphasis, I think, on implementation science, on embedding them in the real world. And sometimes I felt like a lot of the programs were just sort of box checking. And then I found this paper from Dr. Fairman, and I started reading it. And he talked about all these terms that I always talk about, when Jill and I are doing our podcast, ideas like efficacy versus effectiveness, aspects of implementation science, whether or not 1 RMs are appropriate measure when you're working by yourself at home. Anyway, a bunch of stuff. And I saw this paper and I reached out to him and I said, I'd love to have you on the podcast. And luckily he said, yeah. So Dr. Fairman, thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks so much. Delighted to be here.
Yeah. Same question I always ask. Who are you? How'd you get here?
Yeah, so my name's Ciaran. Long journey to get here. I was, involved in sports my whole life and got lucky enough coming out of secondary school to get a scholarship over to the States to play football or soccer. And really kind of that was my main focus for a long time. And through that journey and also my kind of education, well, first of all, I figured I was useless at football, so I had to figure out something else to do. But when I was in college, I had a phenomenal physiology professor who was really challenging me on what was happening to my body when I was playing football, how temperature and pH was changing different systems in my body, and it blew my mind. And so for a long time, I kind of wanted and was pursuing the route of sports science. When my own ma got breast cancer in my third year of college, And I was listening to a lot of what was happening to her body and the changes that were happening when she was getting chemo and radiation in terms of the weakness she was experiencing, the nausea, the sickness, and the fluctuations in fatigue and things like that. And was kind of thinking how much that those negative side effects of treatments mirror what we anticipate of the positive side effects or positive effects of exercise. And so that kind of started this long journey where I've been, really passionate about continuing to learn about how I can help people who are going through cancer treatments help better manage their symptoms, better manage the side effects of treatments, tolerate the treatments better and live long after. And so that's kind of been a almost 20-year meandering journey all around the States, over in Australia, to where I am now in the US as an assistant professor of exercise science, where I direct my own research lab into how all these things can happen, how exercise and nutrition can help people during treatment and after.
That's great. I think that'll give a good background for our audience. So, can you just talk a little bit more generally about your research? I mean, like, what are you known for? So, I know that you work specifically quite a lot with cancer populations, with oncology populations, um, and within that, what has some of your research been on?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd be known for too much per se,
Oh,
but I think I try to. Most of my research centers around resistance training in particular, for a lot of good reasons, in which I think, firstly, the impairments that people experience with cancer treatments, there's essentially this phenomenon called accelerated aging, which is recognized by the National Institute of Health in the States, that says people who get treated with months of cancer treatments generally age about a decade biologically. And a lot of that looks like weakness, frailty, deconditioning, inability to perform day-to-day tasks. And why I'm really passionate about resistance training in particular is that it's a hammer to all those nails, but also the complexity of it. My whole lens at which I view my research is picturing my ma engaging in this work. And that has been a centerfold of how I design my stuff, because it has to make sense to her. And most people intuitively would know that cardio is beneficial, and generally you require less equipment and whatever, whereas to do resistance training safely, it needs a little bit more care in its design and helping people. And so I think both in itself has been kind of a black sheep and lagging behind its relative importance compared to cardio by researchers and policymakers, but certainly the research in exercise oncology has been far behind. So I've been trying to pick up the slack on that.
you kind of alluded to it, but I'd like to pick up on that. Why do you think it is that people are generally the awareness on resistance training is relatively so low? Because I think a that's gendered, and I think maybe that's changed over time, but it definitely seems like there are more barriers to just getting people to pick up and start doing it. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there. So I could say primarily and historically, if you look at all of the physiology research as it relates to activity, the vast majority of early physiologists were runners. And so generally when you're doing research, you do research in areas that you're interested in. And so much of that lends to why the first 50 plus years of research was generally in cardio. And so then you had some really, really big and important studies like the Framingham Heart Study and others that really demonstrated the power in having high levels of cardiovascular fitness and its relation to overall health, well-being, and survival and things like that. So I think it's a consequence of that being so prominent in our recommendations and the public awareness, that if you think about how resistance training came along, a lot of it was more meathead style resistance training. A lot of it was bodybuilders, and it was how do you maximize these really minute, differences in strength or muscle mass. And it's really only been in the last probably 20 or 30 years where we've really focused our efforts in making sure that the benefits of resistance training extend beyond the little meathead community. And then by design, or by nature of that design, you then extend how you would and shape how you would design the resistance training protocols differently for them to be accessible. In that, no one my ma's age needs to be doing a bodybuilder style protocol. And so we've changed how we look and design. On top of, I think, to your last point, which was really important, I think the culture of fitness and wellness looks completely different. I'm in my mid late 30s now, and growing up, strength training was not in sports really. Most of how people did it was in these kind of grimy bodybuilding style gyms. Whereas when I go back to Ireland now, there's so much holistic, wellness. People are doing yoga and saunas and things like that. So I think that the way you promote that holistic wellness, I think, is different.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting. I have this anecdote that I use, and you might have a version of this as well. But if if I was growing. I'm a little bit older than you. I was growing up in the late '90s, and I remember I bought some kind of pre-workout mix. It wasn't even like real stuff. It was like L-carnitine mixed with probably artificial sweetener or something like it. Probably didn't even do anything. I don't even think it had creatine in at the point. And I just remember the marketing. The marketing was so jarring. It had like a ripped bald dude with veins,
Yeah,
and there's like
yeah.
lightning coming out of his eyes. And my mom saw it, and she's like, "What is this? Is this steroids?" And it was so foreign. And now you look at it, and the pendulum's almost swung back in the other direction, where you go on Instagram or something like that, and people putting creatine into everything, and people, you go to your regular gym, and you'll see just people doing, barbell hip thrusts and deadlifts and all these things, and it definitely has become much more normalized. And I think, without a doubt, overall, that's good. I mean, I think there are certain excesses of the fitness and wellness community that sometimes would probably be better if they were reined in a little bit. But at the same time, you can't argue that it's just become so much more accessible. I want to talk about your paper. So you've written a few papers, but the way I found you is this paper. It's called "The Practical Framework for the Design of Resistance Exercise Interventions in Oncology Research Settings: A Narrative Review." Um, and like I said, I read this paper, and it just ticked a lot of boxes for me. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the why behind the paper. What were you trying to address? What were some issues you saw in research and prescription of strength training programs, and how did you try to address them?
So I would start by saying that I'm a really strong advocate of open and transparent science, and that is a consistent and has been a constant evolution for myself. And I'm always learning about better ways to improve how we do our work in that light. And some of that frames what this paper is, in that I view it as essentially the culmination of my knowledge to this date of like, here's everything I think is what's happening, and I don't want to gatekeep that perspective. I want to share it and provide resources for people to help not make the mistakes that I did when I was designing trials for exercise and cancer. And the inspiration was, for a long time, my career was going down the route of sports science. I was a strength and conditioning coach in the MLS, and worked in professional and collegiate settings with athletes. And the way I look at these concepts is that at the elite end of human performance, you have to so carefully worry about training load, rest and recovery, nutrition, how you modify training stress across a season. And then for us normies who are middle aged, walking around, we generally respond to most things, so you don't need as much detail. And then at the other end of that spectrum, when you've got people who are in a place of critical illness or chronic disease, and they're having compromised immune systems or whatever, you do then have to go back to more carefully thinking about training load and stress and nutrition and so whatever. And so when I was early in my career, I was reading a lot of papers in resistance training in oncology, and the way they were published, or the way they were written as published, was we did this training for 20 weeks, and we did 3 sets of 12 for 20 weeks, and that was great, and they got some strength adaptations. And at the time, I had a good bit of personal training experience, and I was like, wait, what? So everyone did everything, and they did 3 sets of 10, no question, for 20 weeks, and they did all the exercises, because there has not been a single person that I've worked with that I have not had to modify something about a protocol. They have a bad shoulder, they have a bum knee, they have COPD or whatever. And I was like, man, I feel like there's way much more nuance that's getting lost in these kind of generically described programs. And I suppose that's kind of what I have viewed my contribution trying to be, which is, can I give a framework for people to think differently about how they design their protocol, but then also how they report it as well. And so there came the paper where I tried to touch on points of, how do you think about individualization? How do you think about program design? What outcome are you looking to target? what are the considerations with all that stuff, and how do you balance the training load and stress and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a good paper, and it's very readable as well. And what I mean is, I guess maybe because it's a narrative review, it's the sort of thing where even if people don't like getting bogged down in academic papers, it's clearly written, and it touches on a lot of different points. And one of the points, and this is when my eyes lit up actually at first, is right at the beginning. You start talking about this concept, this difference between efficacy and effectiveness, and it's something that I think gets glossed over a lot when we talk about strength training and home strength training. Can you kind of pick that apart for me and tell me what that means?
Yeah, a helpful analogy I think would be if you think about, drug trials, or let's say an easy one is a lot of people take anti-inflammatories whenever they have some pain or whatever. So efficacy would be if I prescribed and everyone consumed 500 milligrams of this anti-inflammatory drug, what does 500 milligrams do to your body biologically and whatever? Effectiveness is if I gave 1,000 people and told them to take 500 milligrams every single day, there's going to be all sorts of variations in the dose and how they take it and their adherence to it and all the rest of it. And those are two distinctly different concepts, which is it's one thing for an intervention or a drug or whatever to work under these ideal conditions. It's a completely different thing for you to examine how it could actually work in the community. And I think where I come from again is my MAS is always on my mind when I think about designing these programs, which is I think the efficacy trials that we do in these tightly controlled lab settings where we control everything has relevance and importance, but I think it limits the generalizability and how much our findings can be extended into the community and actually have sustainability in the community as well. And so I think if we focus on the latter, we're going to make more progress to helping people actually engage in the work.
I'm gonna hone down on these words because I don't think I've talked about them explicitly in the podcast before, and I think I might use this in the future as a reference. So I'm gonna use you as a sounding board here. So you talk you reference a lot of ideas in implementation science, which I think is really important. And you just used one of my favorite words, but it's an incredibly ugly word, which is generalizability, which just it sounds bad on the mouth. What does that mean, and why is that important?
Why are you doing research if not to help your community? And if you're in our case, you've got your broad exercise science in a lot of different populations, and then in our case when we're looking at cancer, why are you not designing interventions that will be applicable to the people who are going to use them? And so when I conceptualize generalizability, I want someone in a community setting to pick up this paper and think through differently how they design their community engaged program so my mat can benefit from it. And I guess one kind of extra caveat in the context of oncology is that we have this massive jigsaw. When anyone thinks about cancer, more often than not, unless you've had personal experience, people think about breast cancer, probably think about prostate cancer, maybe colorectal and lung. They don't think about sarcoma, they don't think about pancreatic, they don't think about glioblastoma. And so the jigsaw puzzle that we have is the type of cancer, the stage of cancer, how aggressive the disease is, all determine what type of treatments you get, how much of those treatments you will get, the sequence and the combination and duration of those treatments. And all of those dictate what impairments you're going to see. And so an easy example would be anthracycline chemotherapy is a group of chemotherapy agents that are known to damage the cardiovascular system and cause heart disease, such that someone treated for early stage breast cancer or middle stage breast cancer who gets chemo will likely survive the cancer but die from cardiovascular disease down the line. In comparison, testosterone is a key driver of prostate cancer growth. So the therapy is hormone therapy, which either stops the production of or stops the action of testosterone. So you castrate a man. And so the side effects of that are reductions in bone health, in strength, in muscle mass, and energy and libido and things like that. And so that jigsaw then determines, okay, well, we have different impairments, and then we have to selectively target those impairments with exercise. And that is a hugely long answer to say we are constantly living in this tension, which is when is it appropriate to reduce your sample or reduce the target of your intervention to someone that is a homogenized group of people, whereby we need to look at the targeted effects of exercise on the specific impairments from ADT or prostate cancer treatments versus most people living after cancer treatments will have some degree of weakness and frailty, and we still have to design resistance training interventions for those. So we kind of live on this spectrum of there's times where we need to get really specific, and that's where generalizability would be only able to be extended into that specific population or whatever, versus when we go big picture in a lot of community settings outside the cancer hospitals, they are people who are living with these impairments, and you have to figure out how do you create tailored interventions that are also scalable.
Last question I want to ask you about this before we get into some more specifics about the paper is you've talked a little bit already about sustainability and adherence. I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about that, in terms of how you developed this paper and what you're reacting to.
Yes. I'm laughing because I don't know if it's going to be the last question because of so many thoughts that I challenge myself on. If you go big picture, a lot of research is conducted by funded projects. And we develop these amazing resources, we develop these amazing infrastructures, and then we give people 12, 16, 20-week, 6-month interventions. And we're there. We train you, we help you move your body. And then at the end of the intervention, we say, thanks, Andrew, did great. Here are your improvements. Have a good life. And when the funding dies, the project dies, the resource and infrastructure dies, and then we're left with people are left without any of these resources. And so I find myself constantly living in that tension and challenged by what does it mean? What does it mean to help people create sustainable behavior change? And who is responsible for that? What role does the institution that designs and delivers the research, what role and responsibility does government play? What role and responsibility does the community play? And I think the answer is all the above. And there's also something I'm challenging myself on, both if you design an intervention from behavioral lens versus a physiological lens, they're designed similarly, but they're sufficiently different, where most physiological interventions are, how do we get the biggest change in this outcome? How do we get the biggest size increase in muscle, the biggest size increase in strength? Behaviorally designed interventions are, how do we create sustainable adoption and maintenance of these behaviors? And why I'm giving that context is that generally what we see with the physiological interventions, that they might have this initial spike, meaning they have the large increase. But then if people aren't doing it 2 years later, that spike for 2 months doesn't matter. And then if you think about the behavioral ones, a lot of them, at least when you look through social cog theory or self-efficacy and competence, things like that, they are designed such that they're more so gently introducing the behavior in a way that you can gradually, engage with it to sustain it long term. So the initial effects might not be that big, but the hope is that those effects slowly grow over time as you consistently engage in the behavior. And I think there's lessons to be learned from each intervention by each researchers, meaning I think behavioral researchers could learn a lot from engaging physiological ones or exercise physiologists or whatever, and vice versa. And I think somewhere there's a sweet point where if you think about when those interventions end, one question is, what is the type and dose of connection that I need with this person for them to continue engage in this behavior? And a second question is, what are my biases around someone who has been active and exercise my whole life, thinking that people are just going to automatically love this and want to do it forever? And so if I take that bias away or recognize that bias, what is the least amount of work they have to do to sustain the benefits that we gave them? And so I think those are two, somewhat distinct, but certainly overlapping questions that we're always tasked with.
I want to keep talking about this. This isn't the order I was going to go in, but I think this is really good. I think even just applying this behavioral versus physiological lens is really important, because it's like you said, certain exercise physiologists or even certain kinds of personal trainers, sports conditioning, sometimes they don't even look at the behavioral lens, because maybe for whatever reason, people are already embedded in a community like a sports team, or they already have whatever certain capabilities and motivations, or, they're really into competition where you almost don't have to worry about it, And they look at everything like exactly as you said, just in terms of whatever exercise variabilities there are, like progression, intensity, volume, all that fit VP kind of thing. And then on the behavioral lens, sometimes you see these activities that are like fun, and they're good. Do you know what I mean? Like you see like people going to village halls and doing Zumba or dancing or something like that, or getting people out to do chair yoga once a week. And I don't know how effective chair yoga is in terms of building bone mineral density, or helping with bone quality, or osteogenesis and things like that. Probably doesn't help balance that much, but people are coming out and they're doing it. Is it the best use of time? Sometimes people will talk about, well, return on investment in time. I don't know, but if people are coming and doing it, then it's working. And I see this debate, and I see it on LinkedIn quite a lot, where you have in the UK especially, you have people talking about the importance of physical activity, like active travel, creating movement opportunities, access to green space, all these things that I think are inherently good and have all these complex advantages that are just even too hard to enumerate. And then sometimes, and I'm being a bit unfair here, so you can push back on me because I think you'll do a good job of finding more balance. Sometimes I'll see people who kind of have, both their feet in the physiology sort of lens, and they'll say, nope, we need specific prescribed, exercise prescription that has to be past this threshold of intensity, past this threshold of volume. Anything less than that is a waste of time. Um, and obviously it's somewhere in between, but I don't know. I want you to keep on riffing on this because I think you've got a lot of insight here.
Yes, I've two. I want to make sure to come back to the point that you're like, people need to make sure it's a specific threshold, because I have a lot of strong thoughts on that. But I think perhaps the context is also that I'm a meathead in recovery, and being in that world, there's no thought beyond the outcome, which is this protocol increased strength 40 kilograms more than the other protocol. So let's just do that protocol. And, going into oncology, and particularly my Department of Exercise Sciences in the School of Public Health, you are always asked and challenged, what does that mean? What is the actual clinical relevance of it? What is the tangible impact of that change? And an example of that would be, most people who are trained in medicine, particularly if they don't have an exercise science background, don't understand what a one rep max is. And so it does the community that we're trying to help no favors for us to go in beating our drums of like, this protocol increased one rep max by whatever. What a lot of clinicians understand is a sit to stand test. And a sit to stand test has clearly defined thresholds at which it above or below put people at risk of falls and fractures and comorbidities and whatever. And so when we design our interventions, if you look through that lens, which is firstly, are these different complex interventions actually going to create a sufficiently wide gap in an outcome like a sit to stand that would warrant them being different? Probably not. And then secondly, that complexity is so secondary to people aren't getting active. And so if we can demonstrate that a lot of different interventions yield benefit in this clinically relevant outcome, like a sit to stand, that has tangible anchors to survival, we can then go back to clinicians and say, hey, we know that you recognize a minimally clinically important difference on the scale. We've achieved that with our intervention. Let's look to explore it. And I think that second part of the so what of your outcome doesn't necessarily exist as much in traditional resistance training or exercise literature, where it's assumed greater benefit, the greater, then that's the thing that we do. And so I think having that second piece, I think, is really important. And when I was talking about the biological piece, I fight myself on this a lot, because my earlier training as a master's student was kind of in sports science, and it was all about the magnitude of effects, and everything was about optimizing physiological outcomes. And then my PhD was more so through a behavioral lens, and more than anything, just dealing with human beings. I was dealing with people with breast and prostate cancer who are having these immense life changes, and witnessing the changes that were happening to her body, and confronting myself with like, oh, that thing you had written on paper, maybe that's not the best. And you will see a narrative becoming larger in the field of exercise oncology that is essentially making the case for precision exercise medicine. And it is along the lines of, we have to deliver this targeted exercise medicine in a way that stimulates this stress response, because that stress response evokes changes acutely, like increasing IL-6 or NK cells. And if you look at those changes in some in vitro research, when you throw those cytokines or molecules onto cancer cells in a petri dish, it will manage the cancer cell. And so that has then turned into a narrative. Stressful exercise above these arbitrary thresholds will increase these acute molecules that will then be responsible for fighting the cancer. And I have had enough people in clinics beside me try to move their body, and they have extensive bone metastases where the cancer spread to their bone. They have extensive frailty. They have bad shoulders, bum knees. They have COPD. They have part of their lung removed for surgery, and they can't do it. And so we have to recognize the bias in all of our assumptions to get to that place. And it's kind of like, yeah, if you are sufficiently fit that you can tolerate this protocol, if you have sufficient time to actually complete the protocol, if you have the necessary support and resources to do the protocol somewhere that you can elicit the stress, all of those things have to be true, and you don't have any impairments to get in the way. Because why I'm going on this kind of soapbox is that the contrast is, we're now creating an environment where people feel like they should, and then if you should, then why didn't you? And we don't want to start having that narrative of like, sure, exercise can help in certain conditions, and sure, there's these little things that might help as a consequence, but they're secondary to that initial spike in change is less relevant to, can we help you continue to do this lifelong?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of should, and we see it all over the place. Again, I think if someone doesn't have like a sort of population or behavioral change lens, so much of this gets packaged as willpower, or whatever. I mean, you can go on Instagram and you can see 50 memes right now about like working hard and will to power and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, that's great if, like you said, if everything else is in line, if you are fit enough to engage with it, if you have the resources, the time, if you have the knowledge, if you have the money, if you have access to transportation, all this stuff. And then so much of that gets ignored. And you're right. I think, and this is what we were talking about earlier. Now that so much of exercise has become normalized, I think this guilt of not engaging with it, or not even guilt, this idea that putting the onus on the individual and failing to look at the system, the environment, the community around them, that you can either enable or act as a barrier to this kind of behavior. And yeah, I think it's huge, and I think it falls through the cracks quite a lot. I just remember, I think you answered it anyway, but you said you want to go back to the threshold, but I think you answered that. Did you want to say anything else on threshold?
Yeah, I think it anchors onto what your point was, where you were kind of saying giving this element of guilt and all the rest of it, whereby a lot of the narrative, not a lot, that's not fair. Some of the narrative in our field is that, well, they don't want to get their chemo and they have to do that anyway. So if exercise is a medicine, a lot of people want to do that and they do it anyway. And listen, getting chemotherapy passively infused into your body as a direct impact on your cancer cells or the tumor that's growing in your body is entirely different than the experience of, every time someone says or talks about their experience when they got diagnosed with cancer, that's the only word they've heard that day. Everything else is a blur. It goes out the window. And then we're saying, well, actually, you live 60 minutes away from an exercise center and you live alone and you have 2 kids and you work 2 jobs. Scrap all that and now come to a center 3 days a week. It's not fair to people for us to say, well, they don't want to get chemo anyway, they do that. That's not the same as asking someone to engage in a new and scary behavior. On top of that, we cannot escape or distract ourselves from how much people are afraid. This thing has happened to their body, and now they don't know how to move their body. Is it safe? I don't know what, I have all sorts of different pain that's going on in my body. And so I think it does us no favors to stand on these hills where I think that stance alone gets in the way of helping people, engage in the behavior. And the kind of contrast I would give is that, I'm an exercise person and I've been doing it all my life. And so I'm familiar with most modes and whatever. When I was first learning how to invest or whatever, I was terrified. what do I invest in? Who do I talk to? And who is going to who's going to protect my money? And what should I pay someone? Should I not pay someone? And what funds should I invest in? And all the rest of it. And it was scary. And so I think we have to take our lens off of like when we're studying something and so comfortable with it, we could forget that that same fear exists. When I say, well, go to the gym, and my mom was like, well, what gym? And who are these people that are going to be working with me? And do they know what the cancer experience is? And do they know that I have diabetes and I have osteoarthritis and whatever? And so we have to put that in our mindset of like, it just because we've been doing it for so long, there's people who are brand new to this and terrified. And that has to be at the forefront, where if we're just saying, yeah, but hit your certain percent of 1RM, that does no one any service.
I want to make sure we leave enough time at the end to talk about things like, community scalability, loneliness, built environment, because I think that's a big part. And we talked about this off camera. I want to hit that because I think you speak about it very passionately, and intelligently. Regarding the paper, I want to go back to it because there's a few key points that I want to make sure that I hit because I think it'll be useful for the audience. And you already talked a little bit about it, about this idea of 1RM and why 1RMs are often used in research. It's sort of this lingua franca when we talk about intensity, and it gives the shared vocabulary, across different practices. Um, so there's always this expectation that, we should be doing 1RM, maybe initial 1RM testing, test, retest. Why do you think that's inappropriate in some cases? And then what are perhaps some better and more appropriate options?
I haven't used 1RM to prescribe exercise in about 15 years. And that was when I was first learning about using 1RM to prescribe exercise. And then I did it with about 5 people. I was like, wait, what? This isn't shaking out. How does this isn't shaking out? Even in, you know, so you have to also consider like the dogma and pervasive beliefs that exist in the field. And it's kind of like, well, just because it's always been done, the charts that were used to develop the proportional intensities relative to a 1 rep max, they're archaic and outdated. And the people who originate would say the same. But the idea that you can test someone on week 1 and then predict their performance on a percentage of that in week 6, I think is just really not intuitive to training. And even more so when you think about untrained people. So again, my ma is at this age in her late 60s. She's a bad knee, bum shoulder. She has a lot of excess adiposity and has difficulty moving her body through space. Okay, so I'm going to bring you in and shove you in a leg press and say, lift as much as you can. And she's terrified. And so, firstly, the accuracy of that value initially, I would contend, is not as close or is not as accurate as we're all saying it is. Secondly, the neurological adaptations that happen so rapidly with people who are untrained and getting accustomed to movements happen so quickly that even if that value is accurate, it's rendered obsolete within 2 or 3 weeks. And so, if you take all that into consideration, I think there are fairly strong cases against using 1RM to prescribe exercise intensity. Um, the only reason you would maybe, well, not the only, one of the main reasons I think you would advocate for it, let's say in research trials, is probably having a continuous variable where most of our other tests, like a sit to stand, they can have ceiling effects whereby once you're fit enough, you won't see changes, not because you're not getting fitter, but the test doesn't have the capacity to capture that. But outside of that, in a clinic, I would never really use or test 1RM. And I would add one extra little caveat to that without going into the extent of it, bone metastases where cancer spreads to the bone, there are versions of that where the bone is really, really fragile. And we've had reports in our field where people have experienced fractures attempting a 1 rep max when they've had bone metastases. So pragmatically doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. There is a safety concern in my mind. So let's look at something different. Again, my ma walks into a personal training gym and we say, well, we've got 6 to 8 exercises for you to do. And that's going to be the squat and the hinge. And we're going to do a lunge and we're going to do a push and pull. And my ma has never lunged in her life, intentionally. And she's never hinged her body. We also have to stop denying how long it takes to teach those movements well. And so what we advocate for in our interventions is kind of getting away from this, test you on day 1 and that's your exercise intensity sorted for the rest of the time. It's can we have this onboarding process where we make people feel safe first and we teach them the movements and we don't progress until the movements feel safe and we're comfortable with the technique. And after that, then, which can take anywhere from 2+ weeks to do, then we start to go, okay, we are comfortable that the movement looks safe. Now we'll load the movement. You don't want to load dysfunction. And so we've kicked around a lot of different ways to then say, well, how do you then gauge the intensity and load? And what's informing some of my answer is getting away from the sports science bias, which is precision matters when you're working with elite level Olympic sprinters who can tell the difference between a 9 and a 10 RPE. My ma has never heard the words RPE or repetitions in reserve. And so in addition to the training stimulus to someone who's untrained is often so large that you would contend that working at a 4 rep in reserve to a 3 rep in reserve is going to yield pretty much close to the same outcomes. So we have more room in untrained folks or older people or chronic conditions for a little bit more noise in the accuracy of the subjective assessment of intensity because the signal is so large. And so all that is to say that we have this protocol where we have a familiarization period, and that can run from anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks of an onboarding period. Let's see how you move. Let's help you feel safe, feel comfortable, move your body safely through space. Then we'll look to load that. And then what is the simplest way we can get someone to conceptualize general approximations of intensity? Okay, Andrew, if you were to keep going, and I said, continue to lift this weight, how many more repetitions, how many more times you could lift it? 3, okay. It seems like you probably could do 6. So let's figure out how we're anchoring that. And that's an education in itself. And I guess that answer is coming full circle to your question about why did you design this paper. I didn't see any of that in a lot of the papers I was looking at when it's a 12-week trial. I'm like, I feel like the first month of that was just helping people figure out how to move their body. Is it actually a 12-week intervention? And one of the things I'm most passionate about is normalizing this, normalizing in clinical trials where we're all trying to desperately control every possible variable, that modifications exist, that making people feel safe matters, that we have to change the sets and reps at times. People come in feeling weak, sick, tired, whatever, and we have to change stuff. And if we all as a collective field can normalize that, I think there's going to be more transparent protocols that can be generalizable, that a trainer can read this and go, oh, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I remember the first time I did 1RM testing, newly minted CSCS, and like, this is what you're supposed to do. And this is even with people who were, ostensibly, athletic in the same way as you were saying earlier. It's like, man, there was a period where no one did weightlifting. There's a period where you just wouldn't expect that people had grown up doing whatever rear foot elevated split squats or barbell back squats or front squats or any of that stuff. Now, like, you're working with people of a certain age and a certain level of activity level, depending on their sporting background, you'll assume that they've probably been, exposed to. And even then, right away, it's like, no, this is the risk first reward. And exactly as you said, is it even accurate? People adapt so quickly, especially, untrained strength athletes. That neural adaptation is so quick. I found the same thing. So, I guess the next question is then, how do we handle progress? You were sort of talking about giving people an idea of how to measure their RPE, how they rate their exertion levels and how difficult things feel. How do we make progress, especially if we're in an environment where we don't have micro loading, where we can't add 0.5 kg to the bar every time? Maybe you're working environments where people can do that, but how do we kind of ensure some sort of long-term progressive overload, even if it is modest? We just want to make sure things are generally moving in the right direction if their health allows them to.
Yeah, I think some of my answer is going to be balanced against the idea of traditional, that rep scheme of lower reps, higher load is strength and higher reps, whatever. I think in the context of environments where you are limited in equipment, such as home-based programs, I think you have to be more creative with how you do that. And so again, how can you communicate that to people in a way that helps them conceptualize their progress? So I'm going to answer twofold. First of which is the protocol itself, and then how do you help people anchor progress? And the first part, I think you can look creatively at a lot of different things when it doesn't load isn't or load or intensity isn't modified solely as a consequence of sets, repetitions, and load. It can be the stance, so single versus dual leg stance. And we would have a lot of people who are very comfortable, for example, whether it's resistance bands or adjustable kettlebells, you max out the load and you're comfortable doing your squats with this X amount of load. What's next? Well, you can slow the movement down. You can increase more duration on that to create more tension on the muscle. You can adopt a single stance where you can start to do a rear foot lunge or a forward lunge, or you can start to maybe match or change the pace of which you do it. So you move a little bit quicker. It might be more power orientated and all the rest of it. And so I think there's a lot of creative ways that you can challenge progression, and one of those can be exercise selection in the context of the movement. And that's our model in our clinic in general. Like, again, it comes to the variability. When you think about cancer, there's a 20-year-old and an 80-year-old in the same clinic who are saying, what is for me? And so one does a sit to stand and another does a loaded back squat. And so as long as we have that progression scheme across the exercise selection as well, you can make sufficient progress, I think. And then the anchoring improvements, one of the things that physiologists have to get better at and challenge ourselves more on is anchoring what's important, quote unquote, to us to what is relevant to their lives. So what we do and what we recommend is not just like, hey, we're going to test your strength in 8 weeks, and if it goes up, great. It is the week to week. Hey, look, you're able to do a couple extra sets this time. You're able to do a couple extra reps, and getting them to anchor their progress off of those little changes. And also, hey, how's it been carrying the washing around the house? How have you felt walking up and down out of the stairs? And you'll that's where the beauty comes out of this of, man, do you know what? I went fishing and normally I'm knackered by 12, but I was able to stay out a couple of extra hours on a boat, or I was playing around with the grandkids. If we consistently anchor the improvements that are physiological or not over a program to what's important to their life, I think that is what makes the behavior stickier for them to go, do you know what? Not everyone loves strength training, but I will do this because it allows me to pick my grandkids up and I can have a bit more energy in the day. And I think that stuff is beautiful, that we can consistently reinforce that to help people stay engaged.
Yeah, man, I think that's 100% true. I mean, a lot of what we have a program called Movements for Life. And a lot of what we do, we sort of plan on different ends of the spectrum depending on the population. And there are certain groups where, we don't use any numbers, we don't use any reps. It's all just capabilities, and exactly like you said, anchor it back into everyday activities. And you use the same examples, like, how does it feel carrying groceries? How does it feel going up the stairs? How does it feel playing with your grandkids? Is this helping you do the things that you love to do? And to me, that's so obviously correct in certain cases. Obviously, it's hard to quantify, but I feel like that's a framework that we really need to consider moving forward, because quantification and datafication is just not going to be meaningful for a lot of people from a research perspective, of course. But to make it meaningful for individuals, I just feel like that's one of the biggest gaps that we need to bridge. So I mean, 100%.
You know, what's funny? I have this model now that I speak about because I came from sports science, and I'm so used to having these conversations with the purists of true exercise physiologists who are interested in strength and conditioning or sports science or whatever. And oftentimes it's now adopted a pattern where I fell into it as well. It's almost like that Dunning-Kruger where you have all these principles and then you say, well, of course, everyone should squat, bench, deadlift, do all this heavy movements. And why are you not following these micro undulating, linear, non-linear protocols? And then that's where they stop. If you look at a true card carrying exercise physiologist or strength and conditionist coach or sports science, say, well, you're not doing this. And then I'll say, well, just take 2 years and work with sufficient people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then you will end where everyone ends, which is, oh, I get more knowledge. And I'm like, a lot of that stuff doesn't really matter. And then you come out the other end and you're like, there's a balance. There's a balance with, like, what can we create that's a minimally effective package, but also deliver that to people in a way they're going to stay engaged in it. Because I would also challenge myself, and like, the paper's cool, I think, but it's not groundbreaking. If a sports scientist read it, they'd be like, duh. And it's kind of making the case of like, there's the other end that exists when people are in clinical exercise science that maybe not have the sports science or strength and conditioning background. We also have to do the opposite of this, which is we cannot let our own fears and our own biases get in the way of actually supporting people to engage in the movements. Where you hear my aunt is sick or so and so is getting chemo or whatever, they should just rest. And I think we also have to challenge that aspect as well. So there's somewhere in the middle of borrowing those principles and bringing them in, but making sure that they're modified and adapted to the culture of the people that you're working with.
You said that your paper's not groundbreaking, and one of the things that I always had issue with at the beginning when we were first starting this is like, but I'm like, we're not saying anything new. I kept on saying that to Jill. She's my wife and business partner. And she's like, now make a video. People will find this interesting. It's like, but we've known this for 20 years. This is like, I'm not bringing anything new. And, the only way I made sense of it was through this idea of arbitrage. What that means is like, going back, you were talking about finance, is just like taking something that might not be valuable in one context and bringing it into another context where suddenly it's valuable. And I realized that was the service, was in the communication, the arbitrage of taking these ideas in some places where they seem self-evident, and then modifying them in such a way so they become meaningful to people and they can be very valuable. And once I got over that, then I felt much, much better about saying things like, oh, whatever, lifting relatively heavy things, in high consistency is good for you. Because for some people, like, whoa, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. You said a couple interesting things also when you're talking about like this sort of your early experience, and I also want to talk about movement patterns, because one of the things in the paper is you do talk about getting away from the idea of specific exercises and just thinking about movement patterns. So I'd like to touch on that in a second. But my own experience is the first time I was working with an older population. It was the same thing. It's like, okay, well, I know I was using yeah, I mean, there's so many different models. I think I was using Ian King's models. Okay, I need to do a vertical press. I need to do a vertical pull, push pull, knee dominant. So some kind of squat pattern, some kind of hinge pattern, whatever, locomotion. I can't remember exactly what it has, but I remember I was trying to apply to it. It's like, okay, everyone should be doing squats. And I was working with a group of 70-year-olds, and I'm like, okay, today we're going to learn how to squat. And then as soon as I said it, and I looked around, I was like, oh, this isn't going to work. This was in a small group setting as well, which makes the individualization, extra challenging. And I just realized that it's just not appropriate in that context, which is one of the reasons why, with our older population, we do a lot of task-based challenges, so like things that look like games where we sneak in getting up and down, getting over and under, getting from A to B, things like that. How can you make these challenges so that they're interesting? So you elicit this movement in a way where you can have some kind of progression. Like you were saying, we moved away a lot from just thinking of progression as increasing resistance, progression in terms of, like you said, balance, sometimes complexity, if it's appropriate, adding in a sense of urgency, adding in, a certain dynamism, speed, adding in movements that are a little bit more intimidating. So over time, you can help build up people's capacities and confidence. Because that's a big thing too, is this sort of like return to activities of everyday living. You think of fear avoidance cycles, pain avoidance cycles, fear of falling, and things like this. And so much of that is I think you'd agree with me, getting people's confidence up to engage in the world around them is often so much more important than adding another 2% to someone's back squat. And sometimes that does get lost in the conversation. So, you said the paper's not groundbreaking, but I just thought it was such a good synthesis of all these ideas. And it's the kind of thing that, I hope that if you look at your metrics, I hope that you see a few more people reading the paper when we put in the podcast notes, because I think it's great. I think it's, you used the word holistic earlier, but I think it has that kind of holistic sort of joined up thinking that does a very good job of binding together, I think, different groups and different practices. So I think it's very good on that.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, just on your point even there about when you were saying that you walked into the clinic and you were trying to have people do squats, and you looked around at a group of people who you were like, this is going to work. That a lot of that is my inspiration for this as well, where one of the movements towards this kind of movement based approach rather than specific exercises was that I was doing these large randomized control trials that were like months on end. And again, kind of going back to the efficacy versus effectiveness, a lot of clinical trialists who do resistance training will say, well, you have to homogenize everything. And if you go to like a true like resistance training physiology lab, they'll control the shoes that people are wearing. They'll control the foot placement on a leg press or whatever. And it's just not reasonable in other populations. And I was looking at people doing these same exercises for months on end, and I was like, I would never do that. I would never. The quickest way for me to stop doing this is going to be bored out of my mind. And so many other reasons the variation was put in there, not just a consequence of progression, but also variety and stimulation of there's also something enjoyable about learning the movement and all the rest of it. But I think one asterisk of that has also what has really been on top of my mind in the past few years, where I think everyone has just raced towards telehealth and it's the solution to everything and anything. And the feeling that you had when you were in that clinic going, how am I going to help 10, 70-year-olds squat? I have the exact same feeling when I hear and see so many people go, well, just telehealth away. And I'm like, my ma is so scared to sit down. And how do I help her move her body safely through space? And how do I help her support herself getting back up and stuff like that? And so I think we have to pause and think very deeply about how quickly we're racing towards exclusively telehealth as a panacea for everything. What I think we have to also think about what we're losing. And I'm not talking just like physiological effectiveness of, yeah, they might be as effective, whatever. I'm talking about safety, connection, isolation, engagement, community, where so many people who do behavioral interventions or exercise interventions consistently report, oh, these three people went through at the same time and they've been getting coffee every week since the thing ended. And I think we're at real danger of missing that human connection, just racing towards this telehealth only approach.
Yeah, I was giving a webinar on this earlier, and I've got this book here. It's the Metric Society, and I was just reading it, and I wasn't planning on pulling it out, but I think you kind of nailed it. And it's by Stefan Mao, and he says, um, what did he say? He says quantification of social phenomena is a process of disembedding, which deliberately strips away local knowledge and context of social practices in order to obtain more abstract information that can be recombined and amalgamated with information from other sources. And this idea of quantification, of this need to quantify things, which is very important, is very important for research. I'm not against it, but it disembeds it. It sort of it pulls away all these important considerations from why something is effective, and whether you want to call that a type 3 error, or whether you want to talk about like anthropological terms like emic and etic, and the why behind why certain interventions work. And we do, man, we just forget so much. And like how, in a way, it's almost like in neoclassical economics, this idea of externalities, which are things that fall outside the model, and they say, okay, well, this is really good for the economy, whatever that means. Yeah, I mean, it does also lead to slavery, but let's just ignore that. That's a more extreme version. But all these externalities that often just can't really be quantified, or for whatever reason we don't have the measurements, or we haven't put the resources towards measuring them. And that's the thing, man. How important is it for those people to be getting that cup of coffee once or twice a week, or to get them outside, or just to get them to go on a walk in the woods, or to have a nice time, or to smile, have a chat, make a joke without getting too woolly about it. That stuff is so important. And with the telehealth, and I'm very happy to spend the rest of the interview kind of talking about this. You were talking about that tension between scalability and actually what works at a community, at a human level. And I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, forgive me for what's about to come. um, I grew up. I'm Irish. I grew up in Dublin, which is a big city. But even in a big city, there are things that were natural to us that I didn't think about that were so important until I didn't have them anymore. And that is walkability, the ease of community, and how important the community is, such that I lived in a small working class town and I played sports on my local team, and every single person knew me, the shopkeepers, the bartenders, or whoever. And when I'm walking around the village, people are beeping at me and whatever. And when I came over to the States, I was just blown away by how vast it was, that you cannot not have a vehicle in this country. And the lack of walkability and how the built environments don't have, okay, we're going to build 48 suburban neighborhoods, but we're not going to have a park. We're not going to have a corner shop. We're not going to have anywhere where people naturally congregate. And I've moved 5 times around the States. I was in Georgia, Kentucky, Ohio, South Carolina, North Carolina, and it is pervasive everywhere, such that you have to work so hard in this country to actually develop, engage in, and sustain a community. And one of the things that I will come full circle on, but I talk about a lot with some of my American friends and colleagues, is that Irish people and a lot of European people very commonly will emigrate to a different country. And oftentimes that's for a different life experience or whatever. But more often than not, if they don't, they rarely move within the country. So the people I grew up with either live in the US or Canada or Australia, or they're in the same village I grew up with. Why is that important? That's important because we now have intergenerational communities where you live in the same village as your parents and your grandparents and your cousins or whatever. And if you extend that to the US, very few people move outside the country, but they so commonly and so flippantly move a lot of times within the country. And so my experience being in my mid 30s mirrors a lot of what other people go through. Whereas I grew up in one area, I moved to college in another area, then I did extra training or my early career in another area. If you map the US across Europe, my lived experience is the equivalent of moving from Ireland to Germany to Portugal to Denmark to Spain. And if you were doing that many life moves, you would be so aware of, man, I'm moving to a new community and this is hard and scary. Man, I've got no lifelong friends here, people who know me historically. And when I look across the US and I see my peers who are my age and people much older, I see a lot of people who don't have that. They don't have naturally embedded intergenerational communities. They don't have naturally embedded lifelong friendships. They don't have the shopkeeper they've known for 15 years. And this comes back to your earlier point, which is really important that you said, was like the quantification almost gets away from the tribalism of communities. And what I mean by that, like Sebastian Junger has some cool perspectives on this, but I I am an educator. I don't care for the title of a professor. I don't care for none of the prestige. But I think a lot about historically in communities and tribes, what did it mean to have a village with a medical practitioner and an educator and those roles that society played, and someone who is engaged in wellness. And I think all of that comes back to the big picture here. In the US, we're trying to artificially create what is naturally present in other communities. And that's why it's so important that we think through how we're delivering these things. And I would also say to counter that myself, like obviously it's not centered and solely a US problem. In a lot of countries, social media become more prevalent. The how automatic deliveries and getting your food shops done and all the rest of it is becoming, naturally we are creating loneliness through efficiencies. Everything's getting delivered. I pick up my stuff to go and come home. And so you think about all those micro interactions that you have. I can go from my house back to my house on a 12-hour day. And if I wasn't teaching, if I wasn't in my university position, I maybe see two people. And so all that is to sum up that I think one of the strengths and a lot of people who advocate for telehealth say, well, the burden of traveling to and from the community place where this is delivered, we can alleviate all that and we can have people do it from home. And I would say, what about my ma or my auntie or my granny who actually likes having something to do and it's an adventure? Oh man, I got to go to this place today. And that sometimes that's just a doctor's appointment or a dentist. It doesn't even have to be something that we quote unquote call fun. But they have purpose then in their day. I have a reason to leave the house, and now I'm knocking into the shopkeeper to get change for the bus or whatever. And so, you know, all of that is kind of like the systemic issues that we're up against. But I think all of it carries weight and relevance when we're talking solely about these telehealth approaches.
Yeah, man, it's one of the things I think about a lot. I think Wendell Berry talked about it in a bunch of his essays. One of them, I think, is called "The Two Economies," where I think he outlines this. And people who do the podcast, they've heard me say this before. But just this replacing of reciprocity in relationships with financial transactions. And like you said, every single one of these efficiencies, and I think the idea of efficiency in general, I think is worth looking at, not in this podcast, but really interrogating the idea of efficiency. Because when you put a numerator, on top of a denominator, someone else gets to set the conversation. The moment you put something in that I don't know, lens, then all of a sudden, again, we strip out the meaning. But yeah, just this idea, and man, I know I've said it before in the podcast, but it's like, if you live in an area where it's a smaller community, when I live in rural Scotland, and all the villages are sort of human sized, human scaled, walkable. You still have your butcher, you still have your baker, you still have your greengrocer. People know each other. I can't go get some bread without talking to like 12 different people I know. And it's like, it's great. I mean, it's a privilege, and I moved out here and I feel very, very lucky, to have that. But, man, if you're living, not even so much a city, because I think in some ways, like cities like New York actually probably have more of a community, but these suburbs and these exurbs that you see in America that aren't unique to America, but are endemic in America, where it's just cut off and everything is a transaction and everything is an Uber or an Uber Eats or whatever. And this sort of idea of serendipity, of just meeting one of your old friends and having a chat, it's just so hard, man. And I think it's one of the reasons, and I'll say it, I think it's one of the reasons why America is having as many different troubles that are perhaps unique to America, or perhaps it's a canary in the coal mine, and that's the direction that other countries are moving in as well. But I mean, that's outside the scope of this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on that, there's another, I guess, anecdote I could give, which is I grew up in a predominantly, working class background, and a lot of the community was working class. And so much of my initial drive was, I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to go off on this adventure and, be somebody and fix that. And as I was exposed early in my career to different levels of socioeconomic status, and I started to kind of get, peripherally affiliated with like middle class and stuff like that, I was like, they're not happier. They're not happier. And to your point, I have a commute home where I stop at the same petrol station, and oftentimes on a Friday, I see a lot of different Hispanic communities. They're in the back of a van and they're after getting off a building site together, and there's 20 of them. They're grabbing some beers together, and I'm like, they have it right. You know, they're all together, they're living in their collective communities. And, to your earlier point, if I go home, you know, again, I can bump into a guy I played soccer with 20 years ago, and he introduced his son to me. Like, that stuff is magic, as the connection and direction that we have in life. And I was really struck, and it's something that stuck with me in my mid 20s when I was at Ohio State doing my PhD around a lot of middle class people. I was really struck by, wait, I've been chasing this thing, and I don't even know if it's the thing that I want, because I don't think they're happier.
Yeah.
I think you get your stuff, you move out to your suburbs, to a community that you don't know. And again, obviously people are generally, it's a sweeping generalization. People can be happy
Sure.
and whatever.
Yeah.
But I think universally, I haven't seen a shakeout where I was like, yeah, that's the life that I think is good for contentment.
Yeah, and I think Younger writes about it beautifully as well in his book Tribe. And it's just like you're saying. First thing, especially everywhere, it's not unique to America, but first thing people do is they buy isolation. You go from living with a flatmate, living with a roommate, and because you want to get rid of all those like low level annoyances of, did you do the dishes? Did you not do the dishes? My neighbors are too loud. Turn the music down. It's like, yeah, that stuff gets annoying, but man, it means that you get to chat with people and meet people and compromise. And I do think that in America, I think this pervasive loneliness, especially if people try to make up for it in these sort of surrogate behaviors, like going on social media and pretending that that is somehow equivalent to having friends. And even just like little things like having pushback. Like sometimes I'll say, like, I'll spend too much time on the internet and I'll say something weird. My wife will be like, do you want to think that over? It's like, yeah, that's pretty weird. Yeah, good point. And just having that, and that, like, who knows, maybe that stopped me from spinning off into some weird conspiracy theory, just saying something out loud and having someone push back. I want to let you go, but I want to ask you just one more question, because it just got me thinking, and I was thinking about it whenever I go back to the States. When you go back to your hometown, you start talking to your old friends and buddies and soccer players, football players, or whoever, people are you amazed at how much people remember? Like, when you stay in bed in that community, you kind of have this sort of distributed memory of people telling the same stories and passing stories on. And I go back to my old college town where people are, and I just can't believe how much people still remember. They remember these big nights out, and they remember like who dated whom, and they remember all this drama. And it's so amazing because I'm with you. I've been an expat my entire life. I feel like there are times I don't remember anything about my life, from moving around. It's different now because I've settled and I have a family. But that's one of the things I think about all the time as well.
Yeah, yeah, yes, 100%. I think both how much people remember and where I thought you were going to go was that what people ask me, I go home to my community and they remember who I was, and the only question they ask is, "Are you happy? Are you enjoying it?" And I have an Irish community here in the States, and we have this running joke inside where we essentially count how many questions people will ask us when they first meet us before they ask, "What do you do?" And in the States, the "What do you do?" question is one of the within three,
Yeah. Often one name, what do you do?
and then that's social currency. Then what do you do determines whatever. And so then to your point, when I go home, e- even your idea about quantification, like the local fix-it fella that everyone has been calling to do the putzing around the house for our grannies is still there, and his institutional knowledge, in the sense of like his knowledge of the community, is so deeply ingrained, and it's so invaluable that those pieces are so important to give you familiarity, to make you or remind you who you are. I'm in the States, on my own, as a professor and all the rest of it, and presenting at conferences, and it's so easy to be like, this none of this matters, man. I go home and I'm Ciaran, you know? And I think, even to my earlier point, I feel grateful that I am someone who has that anchor, that I know I have a stable base that I can go home to and go, yeah, this is me. I'll go back off and fight the world and come back and get reminded again.
Yeah, it's all it's Ubuntu, isn't it? That word, like we derive our meaning from the people around us. And if you don't have that, man, that you're right. I mean, we've used the word anchor a lot in this conversation, and I think that's one of the big points is how do you anchor things? And perhaps things are a little unmoored right now. All right, man. All right, Dr. Ciaran Fairman, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
Okay, so that was my conversation with Dr. Ciaran Fairman. I hope you enjoyed it. We actually ended up having a really good chat after the microphones were turned off as well. Really enjoyed talking to him. One of the concepts that came up again and again was this idea of anchoring. I think Dr. Fairman used that term first, and I really enjoyed it. This idea of anchoring or embedding movements, making them meaningful to people. So getting away from this idea of just sets or reps or 1RM percentages, and actually really tying exercise and physical activity into the everyday benefits, So you hear us talk a lot about our capabilities approach that we like to apply. How do we make this movement meaningful? How do we tie it into walking up the stairs, carrying groceries, playing with your grandkids, and really showing people that there are benefits to movement? And it's not something that needs to be prescribed from high above. It's something that you can engage in and really enjoy and be meaningful. So hopefully you enjoyed this conversation. I definitely did. If you did, please go ahead and leave us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen. Really nice if you can put some comments in there as well, just because it's nice to read the comments. So thanks a lot. Talk to you soon. Bye.